Welcome to the frantically messy room where I draw. And here on the desk under the camera is the last drawing that I did yesterday for a video. But next to it, there's something very vital to my drawing results that doesn't make it onto camera, but is extremely vital for the results that I achieve. Not far off camera, where it was flicked just as I started videoing, is my key drawing strategy for the sorts of results I get. And that's my 2 to 3 minute quick sketch of exploratory marks. I've just spent an hour digging through all the mess and the paper on the floor, in the bin, under the bed, to locate more of these scraps of paper, which I don't generally keep. But let me show you exactly what I'm doing with these marks, with these scraps of paper, and explain even more importantly why I'm doing it. There are a few ways to spend 2 to 3 minutes that will improve our drawings as much as doing these. You might have seen this video on drawing weathered stonework. But before I drew this, I did my exploratory mark making. And this is what I did. Usually I try and draw it actual size, and the pen I use is the pen that I think will create the best effect for the scale and the detail. But this gives me a chance to check whether in fact the pen is too wide or too narrow for the effect I want. When I have a drawing that has a particular focus, such as the edges of the weathered stone, I make a point of trying out the marks I'm thinking I'm going to be making and to see if they have the effect I want. I also often just check some other details and get a feel for the perspective angles. This also helps me just to get warmed up with my eye-hand coordination and the sense of movement on the paper and the pen in my hand, so that by the time I actually place marks on the drawing, in a very real way, they're not my very first marks. My very first marks were here, but I can remove them and instead have first marks that are better, perhaps more confident and more effective than they would have been if I hadn't done this. For this video, I was doing 2 quick drawings, but one in 5 minutes and one in 15 minutes of the same scene. So in my exploratory marks, I made sure that I drew them with that same sense of time urgency to see if I could capture effective marks with my pen that would be creating the effect I wanted in a very fast time frame. It lets me trial everything I'm wanting to do, not just the perspective angles. But it does let me try out my observational accuracy of the perspective angles. For this terrace house in Sydney, that's exactly what I did. In fact, I did a better job in my preparatory mark making in terms of capturing the proportions more accurately, because when I did my drawing, instead of placing this line pretty much in the center, I placed this line pretty much in the center and then got confused when the edge of the building wasn't as close to the edge of my drawing as I expected, which caused me to try and stretch the building a little, whereas none of that confusion was present when I was making my marks. Sometimes there might be just 1 or 2 details with my marks that I'm thinking I'm going to use that I'm not 100% sure of the effectiveness of them, such as in this weatherboard house. I wasn't 100% sure how I was going to create the hatching over the top of these weatherboards, which I wanted to be visually quite evident at the end of the drawing. So before I started, I put on a scrap of paper the sorts of marks I thought that I was going to be using to do this. And I wasn't even particularly fussed to capture the architecture exactly, and I was happy enough with that to then go on and use this technique in my drawing. But sometimes I want to test things a little bit more. There are elements involved either in the architecture or in the coloring or the values or the surface textures, such as the bricks, that I feel I need to experiment with. And that's what I did. Quite a lot more detail than I did for the exploratory marks for that last drawing. I particularly wanted to play around with the effect I was going to create in these front windows. Since I didn't want to draw the taped on coverings of black plastic, I also wasn't sure how I was going to capture the effect of the indoor plant showing through pressed up against the window here, as well as just how many lines I would need to capture the 3 dimensions of the architecture here. I always include in these couple of minutes whatever part of the reference I think is going to be trickiest, most difficult, or where perhaps I'm going to do something different from what I'm seeing, and I want the chance to see how my imagination looks translated into marks. This works just as well for non-architectural scenes, perhaps even more important in a scene where the possibility for marks are even more varied. With this scene, I was fairly comfortable with a lot of these trees and foliage and foreground, but I was particularly interested in this section because visually it is a focus point, and wanting to capture the difference between the rock, the stone, the timber, and all the natural vegetative elements around it. And so this was how I spent my, probably for this one, more like 3 or 4 minutes. Still very quick lines, but just having a look at the marks I'm planning to use and see, are they creating the effect? And often I look at this and I think, well, yes, that's working, but if I do it this way or that way, it will help the final result. The final result is an improvement on these marks, but far more than I could have achieved if I hadn't played around with the marks. And if you're finding this interesting, if you're finding it helpful, please hit the like button. And if this could be a video that would benefit people you know who draw, then why not share it and help me as well as them? In this house in Tasmania, I really just wanted to work out this transition in down here from the light on the front facade and the shadow and shade down this side. And so that's what I explored with my marks, as well as just how I might capture the effect, the decorative effect of the brickwork on the corners. Sometimes my mark making is just restricted to one thing that I want to get a sense of. And so here, this gate, I was wanting to know whether I could use the pen thickness that I was planning to use, whether there was enough thinness in the lines to get my gates thin enough looking. And one of the things I took away from my 2-3 minutes of sketching was that I wanted my strips of wood on my fence to look thinner in my drawing than they looked in my preparatory marks. For some subjects, it's not so much to have practice at creating effects, but what I'm wanting is practice actually creating the shape. While I normally draw with a focus on visualizing the 3-dimensional form of my reference, there are times when focusing on the shape, on the flat 2-dimensional outline, can actually be more helpful. So in this view of the Sydney Opera House, in my preparatory marks, I was looking at what it felt like to draw these curves correctly, and then starting with this main one, then moving to the left with shapes, seeing these as flat shapes, not to think of this as the Sydney Opera House from a 3/4 on view, but to see it as just a series of curved triangular shapes fitted together. Although I did take advantage of having the pen in my hand on a scrap of paper just to see how way I was visualizing doing this section here in a very quick gestural sketch. And by doing these curves immediately before and then critiquing them for accuracy, it was easier for me to now see the curves more fully with more understanding and to move my arm in the way that I needed to capture that. But sometimes it's more the effect, which is the focus. And in this scene, for a video on drawing realistic tree trunks, I was wanting to play around with how I would show shadow on the tree trunks to help give a sense of form. Because the photo was taken on a very overcast day, there wasn't anything super obvious in the drawing. And so this took a little bit longer than normal, simply because it takes longer to do hatching marks. But again, I also took advantage of the opportunity in doing this to play around with how will I create the effect of this vine that's falling down or could be growing up to or from the ground in the base of this tree. And I particularly wanted to play around with this hatching, with varying the degree of hatching as we move from top to bottom, that this wouldn't be hatched as a piece of piping which is completely straight and having the same value running down the shade, but that the values would be varied to reflect the fact that as the branch moves slightly towards or slightly away from us, different amounts of light reach it or are reflected off it. But I also got to decide that I didn't want to get the effect in my video drawing as dark as this. And so with the experience of that and the decisions I could now make from this, I got to draw something which was closer to what I was imagining in my mind when I saw the reference. But sometimes we come across an object that really does engage our creativity. And this old truck by the side of the road in Tasmania did just that. But being unfamiliar, it was even more important for me to become familiar before I began to make committed ink marks on the paper. And so my exploratory drawing focused on just my ability to observe these rounded, curving away from me shapes, which at this sort of angle can be challenging to draw, and also to get a feel for the marks and the pen, as well as the shadowed strips in the front of the metalwork of the truck cut into to ventilate and help cool the engine. I find making preparatory marks even more helpful when the subject is not overly familiar. With this blanket box, my exploratory marks let me see how exactly I would interpret the very edged-on view of this padded top, as well as with these pieces of timber that we could see quite clearly how the proportions would have to be able to fit into the center inset, the carving that's the dominant feature of the front. And so by doing this, I could work out that this was looking okay, but I could also see that my initial take on the proportions was not wide enough, which I then hoped let me do it a little bit better than it would have been, but still not wide enough. At times, in a fairly dense scene, it's just one or two elements we want to explore. And in this bushland scene, it was how I was going to use marks to create the effect of these steps, particularly using the 0.5, which is pretty much the largest pen I ever used, to make the marks, to see whether I'd get the amount of blackness I wanted or not enough blackness, whether in fact the marks would look too blobby or not. But in another bushland drawing, my mark making before I started wasn't about a very small part, but really covered all the sorts of marks I thought I was going to be called upon to use to create the effect of the different plants that I saw, the scale that I was seeing them at, as well as creating a sense of depth. And so it's obvious here that you can see that I've used a heavier pen up here and here than for here and for in the background. So I'm playing around with a whole lot of elements that will need to come together if my drawing isn't going to be a tangled mess. If we're going to be able to see that there are plants closer to us and there are plants further away, but they're different to these closer ones, as well as take into effect the value of shaded and shadowed areas and different local color, all of which are affected as distance moves back. So this was very much using marks to explore effect rather than form. I don't have the marks for these 4 drawings, but I remember very distinctly how I used my preparatory mark time with this plush eiderdown. I used it to explore the marks I was hoping to use, create the effect of the overfilled plumpness, roundness, fullness of this eiderdown. Very different with this drawing. I remember I spent my mark making time exploring a mock-up, if you like, down here creating the shadowed effect of the bright sunlight coming through the foliage onto the walkway. With this drawing, my mark making was basically looking at the major foliage types here, 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 this part, and these down here, playing around with the marks I thought I was going to use to create them. And on this bowl, this brass bowl, my mark making was all to do with the foreshortening of this rose pattern band that wraps around. I was going to make sure before I started that I had marks that would effectively capture the transition from looking at this pattern head on to almost looking at it side on, that in both directions it would visually sit in the right place. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you found this little insight into my own drawing style and routine helpful. I can't imagine starting a drawing without gaining all the benefits of this 2 or 3 minute process. It really is the starting point for every drawing. But look, whatever you draw and however you draw it, whether you explore the marks beforehand or not, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.